All right, let's continue with the build-up to the ANC elective conference now by focusing on the incumbent president, who so far looks set to be re-elected for the second term. This after having been endorsed by most provinces so far. Professor Richard Calland has co-penned a book titled The Presidents, From Mandela to Ramaphosa, Leadership in the Age of Crisis. And he joins us now. Prof, thank you for making time. In this book, The Presidents, From Mandela to Ramaphosa, Leadership in the Age of Crisis, you present 5 case studies in the presidential leadership based on the 5 post-1994 democratic era presidents of South Africa. What did you uncover?
I think what we uncovered was a very interesting different set of approaches to crisis and to leadership and to presidential power. You know, the South African Constitution confers considerable power on the president, but of course it balances, it checks it, because we're a constitutional democracy. And so the rules of the game will constrain a president if he or she goes beyond the rules, as indeed several have, but in particular, of course, President Zuma, who was checked by the courts on numerous occasions, and ultimately by the Zondo Commission. The key point we make in this book is that all of them have confronted different kinds of intense crisis. And if anything, Ramaphosa, the current president, has faced the biggest set of crises of all. If you add COVID to the economic crisis, the climate crisis, and so on. The question is, how did they respond? Did they use the power that the presidency has bestowed upon it, or did they not? And we find that President Mandela in particular, and to some extent Mbeki, used their power in a strategic sense. They made big choices and came down on one side or other of a difficult issue, whether it was nation building in Mandela's case or the economic policy of the gear replacing RP in Mbeki's case. Ramaphosa, however, we see as a bit of a fence-sitter. He fails to make those big strategic choices. He's a tactician, and he tries to build support, and ultimately, unfortunately, he moves too slowly for the requirements of the age, the times.
Yeah, and let's focus more on this fifth and current, well, the current president, right, who is facing this anxious wait to see if he can secure re-election as ANC president. With that kind of indecisiveness and lack of boldness, because that's what even some of those close to him told you guys, what chances does he stand?
Well, most of the people we spoke, the insiders who work with Ramaphosa, even his close friends, they say two things which perhaps don't quite add up. On the one hand, they say that he is a consensus builder. He likes to consult. He likes to build support for any big issue or topic that he has to move forward. On the other hand, they say that sometimes they find it very frustrating that he's unable to reach a decision that needs to be taken. And often his failure to take a decision costs him politically. For example, he failed to act as soon as he could have done with the suspension of the public protector. As soon as he had the authority from the courts to make that decision, he could have done, instead of which he dilly-dallied for several weeks, and then ultimately that cost him, because the public protector then, of course, launched her inquiry into Phala, and the next day suspended her, which obviously looked bad. But he was an architect of his own misfortune then. And so the point that some of even his close lieutenants and supporters make is that they wish he would be more decisive. They wish he would seize the moment.
Has he always had this character, Prof? And has there been a change in his character from his days as a courageous trade union leader in the 1980s? Because in the book you compare Ramaphosa 1.0, right, the 1980s version, with Ramaphosa 3.0, who is now the current president.
Well, it's a very interesting question. Thank you for raising it. Indeed, the people we talked to who knew him well in the 80s describe a very different sort of political animal, someone who was bold, courageous, and decisive. And of course, the point that some of our other sources made, including Rolf Meyer, who was, as you know, his opposite number during the negotiations in the early 90s, Rolf Mayer and others make the point that when you're president, you have a very different role. You're not leading for one organization or negotiating on behalf of one set of interests. You have to, as president, balance and manage a whole range of competing interests in the country, in the economy, and even, of course, in the ANC, in your own party. And in seeking to balance all those of interest, there is a danger you get kind of stuck in the treacle of it, and your feet start to move ever slowly. And that's really the case. If we were not in a deep economic, social, and environmental crisis, perhaps his style of government would be appropriate. But we're not. We face great fragility, great urgency. And that decision-making tempo, we argue in the book, is not fitting of the times.
Yeah, so his history then as a negotiator perhaps explains why he's so keen on these consultations. Hence he's often referred to as Ramaconsulta by those who feel he often overdoes it. To be fair, Prof, do you think, because when you compare the presidents, you've got to, you need to take into account the surrounding socio-economic and political context. You need to consider the individual leader's history, their experience and record, and even perhaps credentials, because the stronger the credentials, I imagine, the higher the expectations.
I think that's right. And you mentioned Ramaphosa 1.1, 3.0. Ramaphosa 2.0 was when he went into business for 10 years. I mean, here is a guy with a CV that is, I think, better than any president or head of state or prime minister anywhere in the world. He's been in the unions, he's been in business, he's led the constitution-making process, he's been in government, he's ran the National Planning Commission, and now he's president. I mean, it's remarkable multi-sector kind of CV. He should be able to see the problem from all angles. I think he does. But therefore, to my mind, we should indeed have high expectations of him. We believed up until Pala that he's a man of integrity, someone who's a reformer, who can rebuild institutions, and so there are indeed high expectations. The other side of that coin, however, is that the challenge he faces, the headwinds that he has to fly into are so great that it's, in a sense, a mission impossible, that no one could really succeed in these difficult circumstances, not least because he has such a divided and fractious political party behind him. His choice has been to continue to try and bring that party with him and to not lose touch with it. That was a strategic choice, perhaps, but it's one that may well have cost him dearly. Ultimately, the test for his legacy in the end will be if he can win next month, will he govern in a more decisive fashion in his second term?
Yeah, and there have been many other strategic moves. I'm just remembering, which is something you also mentioned in the book, him agreeing to stand as deputy on Jacob Zuma's winning slate at the ANC's conference in Mangaung. And some people felt, you're risking it. And he knew the kind of man that he was joining forces with. So when we look at integrity, when we look at transparency, which is what this Ramaphosa 3.0 really promised when he came in, with the Tumamina, Ramaphoria and all, is that what he's demonstrated so far, Prof? Integrity, transparency?
Well, I think he's rebuilt significant institutions, whether it's SARS or the National Prosecuting Authority and so on. And when it comes to the big policy issues of the day, the just energy transition, for example, he established something called the Presidential Climate Commission, which is classic Ramaphosa because it's a multi-stakeholder body. But it was very inclusive, very transparent, really an excellent model of democratic process, I would argue. And what it did was to forge the consensus around the just energy transition, which we now have on the table. That provides a huge economic opportunity to the country to move from a fossil fuel dependency to a greener future with more better paid, better skilled jobs. And that's the upside of Ramaphosa's approach to government. Of course, Pala has dented his credibility. The way he's chosen to handle it by saying very little in public, I think has dented his credibility, as I say. Will it cost him next month? It remains to be seen. Probably not. He probably will, as you said in your intro, win the presidency of the ANC again. What happens next is really the question. Will he be more decisive in his second term?
Yeah, and that's the big question. Professor Richard Calland, thank you for making time for us this afternoon.